Greetings, students, and welcome to Complexity Fuel. My name is Mr. Little, and boy, if the second week of January wasn't one of the most turbulent weeks we've seen so far. What I'm looking at here is an excerpt from a letter that was put out by the Vice President Mike Pence shortly before the violent attack on the U.S. Capitol by demonstrators seeking to disrupt the final count of the U.S. election. The attack on the Capitol got a lot of attention, as I think it rightfully should. Something about this letter actually caught my attention I would like to share with you now. There were individuals who wanted Mike Pence to dispute the election count, the electoral vote count. Mike Pence declined to do this, and he simply said that the reason he could not do this was because the Constitution did not give him the power to do so. And I quote, "After a careful study of our Constitution, our laws, and our history, I believe neither view is correct. It is my considered judgment that my oath to support and defend the Constitution constrains me from claiming unilateral authority to determine which electoral votes should be counted and which should be not." And I thought that was very interesting because it wasn't loyalty to support and defend an individual, right? It wasn't loyalty to support or defend a nation. It was his loyalty to support and defend the Constitution. And what that really says about the power of constitutions. In history classes, we also talk a lot about constitutions, their influence, and how they were formed and their value to democracy. The view supported is often very linear and straightforward. And I'd like to take a moment to make this view just a little more complex. So when discussing democracy and constitutions and political ideas in AP World in the later half of the 18th and 19th century, what do you actually have to know? Well, what you do have to know is that it was discontent with monarchist and imperial rule that encouraged the development of systems of government and various ideologies, including democracy, and included in there is constitutions. So essentially, it was people upset with absolute authority that then turned to constitutions and democracy in order to change their societies. You may have heard in your history classes terms like democracy, law code, and constitution. A law code is literally just a collection of all laws put together. It can be long or it can be short, but all it is the law. There is no organizing principle behind the law. Same thing with democracy. We talk about democracy as a post-Enlightenment phenomenon, but the truth is on a local level and on a small level, democracy is one of the oldest phenomenons in history. Everyone from caliphs to guild leaders have been elected historically, but electing your leader is not an organizing principle. For example, if you elect a leader, but then put no restraints on what sort of power they can exercise, you don't really have an organizing principle. And this is what a constitution is. A constitution, being a series of documents, written or unwritten, is the supreme law of the land. It describes the source of sovereignty, usually from the people, although you could also say the source of sovereignty is a divine entity. It organizes the government. It might divide or separate powers, enumerated rights and obligations of branches of government and individuals in government. Let's have a look at the United States Constitution. For example, let's just take a look at Article 1, the very first article. Right away that all legislative powers, that is the power to make laws, shall be vested in a Congress. Then it proceeds to describe how that Congress shall be chosen. And then it proceeds to describe how a law can be made via the Congress and via the other branch of government, right? And then it lays out explicit laws that Congress can make. And so what we see in the US Constitution is an organizing principle. Here's how the government's going to work. Here's what it can do. Here's what it can't do. And here's its relationships to other sources of power. And when Mike Pence said that the Constitution did not give him the right to do what other people were asking him to do, he was referring to a particular part of the Constitution known as the 12th Amendment, which has him, the vice president, overseeing the count of the electoral votes. And since the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, it is a law above other laws, he could not violate that law. In the United States and in much of the Western world, we follow a pretty standard historical narrative in which we trace the concept of constitutions directly from the ancient Greeks through the Romans, through the Middle Ages in Europe, and to modern constitutions which come about with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And while there is definitely an ancient Greek constitution that had an influence on the ancient Roman constitution, it's much more complicated than that, because one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that most constitutions are actually unwritten. Both the Roman and Greek constitutions were not written down. We only know about them because other people talked about them. Constitutions existed outside of this tradition, and a number of constitutions may have just been lost because they weren't written. There are a number of famous constitutions that were unwritten that we only know about because of testimony, right? How many other constitutions, organizing principles, have we lost historically because they just weren't written and their memory was forgotten? In this sense, it would be incorrect to claim that Europe or the West or the Enlightenment has some sort of monopoly on the concept of an organized principle of government, since there are a number of examples of constitutions that exist outside of the Western tradition. However, most constitutions today are what we would consider modern constitutions. Now, what is a modern constitution and where does it come from? Well, a modern constitution comes out of the European political Enlightenment. And the reason it comes out of this movement is because this movement, the European political Enlightenment, emphasized the individual ability to reason rationally, and therefore, as a result, the individual ability to exercise political authority, the idea that the individual has natural rights as a result of this reason. These are very common Enlightenment ideas, and you see them reflected in many modern constitution. And this is a fundamental shift from older versions of constitutions, some of the ones I showed you on the previous page, where instead of representing all interest groups, which was the purpose of previous constitutions, make sure that all interests were represented, everybody felt like they had a say at the table, modern constitutions tend to focus on the rights of individuals. And any scholar of history will tell you that who gets to be in the Constitution has evolved very quickly over the course of history. But nonetheless, it's that shift to focusing on individuals that is fundamentally different in modern constitutions from what some scholars have called traditional constitutions. It is possible that this notion of modern constitutions may not have lasted very long or gone very far had Europe not undergone an industrial revolution and an age of imperialism that would popularize these ideas, sometimes by force, and create a situation in which the rest of the world seeks to emulate European-style constitutions. And the concept of modern constitutions and constitutions in general are not without their critics. Constitutions can be abolished or modified to fit the whims of those in power. Unwritten constitutions are particularly vulnerable to cults of personality. That is, constitutions that rely on unwritten principles can be vulnerable to people who don't respect or acknowledge those principles. The presidency of Andrew Jackson was one very early example of this, but the presidency of Donald J. Trump, as has been pointed out by many scholars and commentators, was uniquely unusual because of the president's disregard or disrespect or disdain of unwritten constitutional principles. And finally, modern constitutions and constitutions in general can be used as a tool to support an existing unjust system. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Constitutionalism, what is taken to be the obvious meaning of a key term like equal before the law is what the dominant group understands or claims it to be. Modern constitutions are a relatively new thing, but that doesn't mean that constitutions themselves are actually new. So where can you use this information? Well, any essay that possibly discusses the Enlightenment, responses to the Enlightenment, the spread of Enlightenment ideas, the Age of Revolution, or nationalism. You could talk about the long, complicated history of constitutions, the unique structures of constitutions, or you could point out the idea of constitutionalism being explicitly linked to the Enlightenment is somewhat of a Eurocentric point of view. Using one or more of these ideas is a quick way to make any essay just a little bit more complex. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was able to help you. If you appreciate this kind of work, please like and subscribe. And of course, I welcome any kind of feedback or suggestions, so feel free to leave a comment down below. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.